Picture this. A man in elaborate armour approaches a battlefield, not with the grim determination of a soldier heading to war, but with the careful deliberation of someone attending a formal ceremony. He stops, removes his helmet and announces his name, his lineage, his accomplishments, and formally challenges any worthy opponent to single combat. Around him, hundreds of others are doing the same thing. Meanwhile, peasant foot soldiers with spears are already dying in brutal anonymous melees just a few hundred yards away. This is medieval Japan, where warfare operated according to rules so complex and contradictory that they would make a modern lawyer dizzy. For the next few hours, we're going to explore 1,000 years of samurai warfare, from its mysterious origins in the mists of the 9th century to its final, desperate stand in the 19th. So settle in, forget about time, and let us transport you to a world where honour could be worth more than life itself, and where the difference between victory and defeat often came down to understanding the unwritten rules of a game that lasted a millennium. The story begins not with samurai at all, but with something far stranger. In the early 9th century, Japan was supposed to be at peace. The imperial court in Kyoto had spent decades perfecting a system of government borrowed from China, complete with bureaucrats, written laws, and the firm belief that civilization had finally triumphed over barbarism. The last thing anyone expected was that some of the empire's most remote provinces would become the birthplace of a warrior culture that would dominate Japan for the next 1,000 years. But that's exactly what happened, and it started with tax collection. The imperial government had a problem. Their beautiful system of laws and bureaucracy worked perfectly well in the capital, but out in the provinces, especially in the wild eastern regions that would later be called the Kanto, local strongmen were simply ignoring imperial authority. They weren't paying their taxes, they weren't following imperial law, and when imperial officials showed up to enforce compliance, these strongmen had an annoying habit of killing them. The court's solution was both elegant and disastrous. Instead of sending more bureaucrats, they began appointing some of these local strongmen as imperial governors, essentially legitimizing their power in exchange for nominal loyalty to the throne. These newly appointed governors needed to maintain order in their territories, collect taxes, and defend against the various bandits and rebels who plagued the countryside. To do this effectively, they began to develop something the imperial court had never really needed: a professional warrior class. But here's where things get interesting. These early warriors weren't just thugs with swords. They were landowners, administrators, and often quite educated men who found themselves in the peculiar position of having to fight to maintain their authority. They began to develop their own culture, their own values, and their own way of conducting warfare that was utterly unlike anything seen before in Japanese history. The first thing that set these proto-samurai apart was their relationship with horses. In the mountainous terrain of much of Japan, cavalry had never been particularly important. But in the eastern provinces, with their wide valleys and open spaces, mounted warfare became not just practical, but essential. These warriors became superb horsemen, developing techniques of mounted archery that would become legendary. More importantly, they began to see warfare not as a necessary evil, but as a noble pursuit in its own right. This was a radical departure from both Chinese military philosophy and traditional Japanese attitudes toward violence. In the imperial court, military matters were considered beneath the attention of truly civilized people. But these frontier warriors began to develop an ethos that celebrated martial skills, personal courage, and individual achievement in battle. By the 10th century, this new warrior culture had produced its first great champion, a man named Taira no Masakado. Masakado was everything the imperial court feared about these eastern warriors. He was powerful, independent, and utterly contemptuous of central authority. In 935, he began what was essentially a private war against his relatives and neighbours, using it as a pretext to expand his own territory and influence. What made Masakado dangerous wasn't just his military skill, but his political ambition. In 940, he did something that shocked the imperial court to its core. He declared himself the new emperor. Not content with mere regional autonomy, Masakado claimed to be the legitimate ruler of all Japan, established his own court, and began appointing his own governors throughout eastern Japan. This was treason of the highest order, but it was also something else, a clear declaration that the age of pure civilian rule was over. Masakado was saying, in effect, that political power would now flow from military strength, not from imperial appointment or bureaucratic competence. It was a revolutionary moment, and if Masakado had succeeded, Japanese history would have taken a completely different course. But Masakado didn't succeed, and the manner of his failure tells us everything about the nature of early samurai warfare. He wasn't defeated by an imperial army or by superior strategy. He was defeated by his own relatives, who had grown tired of his ambitions and decided that his death would serve their interests better than his continued existence. In February of 940, during what was supposed to be a minor skirmish, Masakado was struck in the forehead by an arrow and killed instantly. His head was cut off and sent to the capital, where it was displayed as a warning to other would-be rebels. But the warning came too late. The precedent had been set. Political power in Japan would increasingly depend on military strength, and military strength would be controlled by a new class of professional warriors who were beginning to call themselves samurai. The death of Masakado marked the beginning of what historians call the rise of the warrior class, but it would be more accurate to say it marked the beginning of a centuries-long experiment in controlled chaos. The imperial court, rather than trying to eliminate these warriors, decided to co-opt them. They began granting military appointments to the most powerful warrior families, essentially creating a parallel power structure that existed alongside the traditional civilian bureaucracy. This system might have worked if the warrior families had been content to simply serve as the military arm of the imperial government. But warriors, it turned out, had their own ideas about how society should be organised. They valued personal loyalty over abstract law, martial skill over scholarly accomplishment, and direct action over careful deliberation. Most importantly, they believed that power should belong to those strong enough to seize and hold it. The clash between these two worldviews came to a head in the late 12th century during a period known as the Genpei War. This conflict began as a succession dispute within the imperial family, but it quickly became something much more significant, a final contest between the old imperial system and the new warrior culture for control of Japan. The two main protagonists were the Taira and Minamoto clans, both descended from imperial princes who had been given surnames and sent to the provinces centuries earlier. By the 1180s, these families had become the most powerful military forces in Japan, and they found themselves on opposite sides of a dispute over who should be emperor. But to understand what made the Genpei War so significant, we need to look at how these warrior clans actually functioned. They weren't armies in the modern sense, with clear chains of command and unified strategies. Instead, they were networks of personal relationships bound together by oaths of loyalty that could be remarkably fragile. A samurai's primary loyalty was to his immediate lord, who had granted him land in exchange for military service. That lord, in turn, owed loyalty to a more powerful lord, and so on up the chain. But these relationships were personal, not institutional. If a lord died, his heir had to actively work to maintain the loyalty of his father's followers. If a lord proved weak or incompetent, his followers might simply transfer their loyalty to someone more promising. This system created armies that were incredibly flexible and resilient, but also unpredictable. A single charismatic leader could quickly assemble a massive force, but that same force could dissolve just as quickly if the leader made a serious mistake or if his followers found better opportunities elsewhere. The Genpei War demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of this system. The conflict began in 1180 with what seemed like a hopeless rebellion. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the head of the Minamoto clan, had been in exile for 20 years following an earlier failed uprising. He had perhaps a few dozen loyal followers and no realistic prospect of challenging the Taira, who controlled the imperial court and commanded the loyalty of warriors throughout western Japan. But Yoritomo understood something about warrior culture that the Taira had forgotten. He understood that loyalty was conditional, and that warriors would follow strength wherever they found it. Instead of trying to match the Taira's conventional military power, he offered something different, a vision of a society where warriors would rule directly, without having to bow to court nobles or worry about bureaucratic interference. This message resonated powerfully with warriors throughout eastern Japan. Within months, Yoritomo had assembled an army of thousands. More importantly, he had created a new kind of military organization, one that combined the personal loyalty relationships of traditional warrior culture with more systematic approaches to command, logistics, and strategic planning. The war that followed lasted 5 years and transformed Japan. It wasn't just a conflict between two families, but a laboratory where new forms of warfare were tested and refined. The early battles were fought according to traditional patterns, with individual warriors challenging each other to single combat while their followers watched. But as the war progressed, both sides began to experiment with new tactics, coordinated cavalry charges, disciplined infantry formations, and sophisticated siege techniques. The turning point came in 1184 at a battle called Ichi no Tani. The Taira had established what they thought was an impregnable position on the coast near modern-day Kobe, with their backs to the sea and their flanks protected by steep cliffs. It was exactly the kind of defensive position that should have been impossible to assault using traditional samurai tactics. But Minamoto no Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's younger brother, had other ideas. Instead of launching a frontal assault, he led a small force of cavalry down what everyone believed was an impassable cliff face, directly into the rear of the Taira position. The attack was so unexpected and so devastating that the Taira army disintegrated within hours. The audacity of Yoshitsune's attack would have been remarkable in any military context, but in the world of samurai warfare, it was revolutionary. Traditional warrior culture emphasized individual prowess and honorable combat. What Yoshitsune had done was subordinate individual glory to strategic effectiveness, and in doing so he had won one of the most decisive victories in Japanese history. But victory came with a price, and that price was the beginning of a fundamental tension that would define samurai culture for the next 7 centuries. On one hand, samurai continued to value individual honor, personal courage, and face-to-face combat. On the other hand, military effectiveness increasingly required discipline, coordination, and tactical flexibility that sometimes conflicted with traditional notions of honorable behavior. This tension was visible in the final phase of the Genpei War, which culminated in 1185 with the naval battle of Dan-no-ura. The Taira, driven from their positions on land, had taken refuge on their ships in the narrow strait between Honshu and Kyushu. They hoped that their superior naval skills would give them an advantage over the largely land-based Minamoto forces. The battle that followed was unlike anything seen before in Japanese warfare. Instead of individual combats between heroes, it was a mass engagement involving hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors. The fighting was chaotic, desperate, and ultimately decisive. When it became clear that defeat was inevitable, the surviving members of the Taira leadership chose death over capture, jumping into the sea while wearing their armour. Among those who died was the child Emperor Antoku, barely 6 years old, who was carried into the waves by his grandmother. His death marked not just the end of the Taira clan, but the end of an era. Never again would the imperial court control its own destiny. From 1185 forward, real power in Japan would belong to whoever could command the loyalty of the samurai. Yoritomo's victory established the first shogunate, a military government that would rule Japan in the emperor's name for the next 700 years. But the new system that Yoritomo created was even more complex and contradictory than what had come before. The emperor remained the theoretical source of all authority, but real power was exercised by the shogun, who was in turn dependent on the loyalty of thousands of individual samurai scattered across the country. Each of these samurai held land in exchange for military service, but they also had their own interests, their own ambitions, and their own interpretations of what loyalty required. The result was a political system that was simultaneously highly centralized and radically decentralized, capable of mobilizing enormous military resources, but also prone to sudden and catastrophic collapses. The contradictions of this system became apparent almost immediately. Yoritomo spent the years after his victory trying to consolidate control over his followers, often by eliminating potential rivals within his own family. His brother Yoshitsune, the brilliant tactician who had won the war, was forced to flee when Yoritomo became convinced that his popularity with other warriors posed a threat to the new order. This pattern of internal conflict would repeat itself throughout the history of samurai warfare. Military leaders who were supremely effective at defeating external enemies often proved incapable of managing the political complexities of their own success. The same personal loyalty relationships that made samurai armies so formidable in battle also made them inherently unstable as instruments of governance. The early decades of the Kamakura shogunate, named after Yoritomo's capital, were marked by a series of succession crises and power struggles that eventually led to the effective elimination of the Minamoto family as a political force. Real control passed to the Hojo clan, who ruled as regents for puppet shoguns, who in turn ruled in the name of puppet emperors. It was a system of layered authority so complex that even contemporary observers sometimes had difficulty figuring out who was actually in charge. But however confusing the political arrangements might have been, the military system that emerged from the Genpei War proved remarkably effective. The Kamakura period saw the development of what might be called classical samurai warfare, a highly ritualized form of combat that balanced individual prowess with tactical coordination, personal honor with military effectiveness. At the heart of this system was the mounted archer. Samurai warfare of the 13th century was dominated by heavily armed cavalry, each warrior equipped with a powerful composite bow, dozens of arrows, and a long, curved sword for close combat. These warriors trained from childhood in the difficult art of shooting accurately from horseback, developing skills that made them among the most formidable military forces in the world. But technical skill was only part of what made samurai effective. Equally important was their approach to battle, which combined practical tactics with elaborate ritual. A typical engagement would begin with individual champions from each side riding out to announce their names, their ancestry, and their accomplishments. This wasn't just showing off, it was a way of establishing the stakes of the battle and ensuring that acts of valour would be properly witnessed and remembered. Once the formal preliminaries were complete, battle would be joined, but even then the emphasis remained on individual achievement within a collective effort. Warriors sought opportunities to distinguish themselves through acts of courage or skill, but they also understood that victory depended on coordination with their allies. The result was a form of warfare that was simultaneously highly personal and highly organised. This system was put to its ultimate test in the late 13th century, when Japan faced the most serious external military threat in its history, the Mongol invasions ordered by Kublai Khan. The Mongols had conquered China, Korea, and much of the known world using military techniques that were completely different from those employed by the samurai. They emphasized mass formations, coordinated tactics, and the use of gunpowder weapons. Most importantly, they had no interest in individual combat or ritualized displays of valor. When the first Mongol invasion fleet arrived in Kyushu in 1274, the cultural clash was immediate and profound. Samurai warriors rode out to challenge individual Mongol commanders to single combat, only to find themselves targeted by coordinated arrow volleys from dozens of enemy archers. Mongol forces advanced in disciplined formations, supported by catapults and explosive devices that the Japanese had never seen before. Initially, the samurai were at a severe disadvantage. Their traditional tactics were useless against an enemy that refused to fight according to the rules of honourable warfare. Individual prowess counted for little against coordinated mass attacks. The elaborate rituals that preceded samurai battles were not just ignored by the Mongols, they were exploited as opportunities for surprise attacks. But the samurai adapted with remarkable speed. Within days of the first encounters, Japanese commanders had begun modifying their tactics to deal with the new threat. Instead of individual challenges, they began coordinating group attacks. Instead of relying solely on mounted archery, they began using infantry formations armed with spears and naginata. Most importantly, they began to understand that defeating the Mongols would require abandoning some of their most cherished military traditions. The first invasion was ultimately repelled, partly through military adaptation and partly through sheer luck. A typhoon struck the Mongol fleet, destroying many ships and forcing the survivors to retreat to Korea. But both sides understood that this was only a temporary reprieve. The Mongols would return, and when they did, they would be better prepared. The 7 years between the first and second invasions saw a remarkable transformation in Japanese military culture. The Kamakura government mobilized resources on a scale never seen before, building fortifications throughout Kyushu and assembling the largest army in Japanese history. More importantly, they began to systematically analyze Mongol tactics and develop countermeasures. When the second invasion came in 1281, the Japanese were ready. The Mongol fleet was much larger this time, carrying perhaps 150,000 soldiers from China and Korea. But the Japanese had learned to fight as the Mongols fought, using coordinated tactics and disciplined formations. They had also built a stone wall along the coast of Hakata Bay, forcing the invaders to fight at a severe disadvantage. The second invasion lasted for 2 months, with fighting that was more intense and sustained than anything previously seen in Japanese warfare. The Mongols established beachheads on several islands, but they were unable to break through the Japanese defences on the main island of Kyushu. Japanese forces, now fighting according to modified tactics that emphasised group coordination over individual prowess, proved capable of matching the invaders in pitched battle. But once again, the ultimate outcome was decided by weather. Another typhoon struck the Mongol fleet, this time with even more devastating effect. Thousands of ships were destroyed, and perhaps 100,000 Mongol soldiers drowned. The survivors were hunted down and killed by Japanese forces, ending forever the threat of foreign invasion. The successful defence against the Mongols had profound consequences for Japanese military culture. On one hand, it validated the effectiveness of samurai warfare when properly organised and coordinated. On the other hand, it demonstrated that traditional samurai values and tactics were not sufficient by themselves to deal with truly serious military threats. The result was a military culture that became increasingly complex and contradictory. Samurai continued to value individual honour and personal combat, but they also understood that survival might require subordinating these values to military effectiveness. They continued to practice the elaborate rituals of traditional warfare, but they also trained in the coordinated tactics that had proved essential against the Mongols. This tension became even more pronounced during the 14th century, as Japan entered a period of almost continuous civil war. The Kamakura shogunate, weakened by the enormous costs of defending against the Mongols, began to lose control over its vassals. Regional strongmen started asserting their independence, leading to a series of conflicts that would last for more than 2 centuries. The most significant of these conflicts began in 1333, when Emperor Go-Daigo attempted to restore direct imperial rule. This might seem like a purely political dispute, but it quickly became a military contest that would transform samurai warfare yet again. Go-Daigo's rebellion succeeded initially, destroying the Kamakura shogunate and briefly restoring imperial authority. But the emperor's success created new problems. The samurai who had supported his rebellion expected to be rewarded with land and positions, but Go-Daigo had limited resources to distribute. More importantly, many samurai found that they preferred the practical, military-focused governance of the shogunate to the elaborate, ceremony-focused administration that Go-Daigo attempted to recreate. Within 3 years, the imperial restoration had collapsed, and Japan found itself divided between 2 competing imperial courts, each claiming to be legitimate. The resulting conflict, known as the Nanbokucho, or Northern and Southern Courts period, lasted for more than 50 years, and saw the development of new forms of samurai warfare that would dominate the next phase of Japanese history. The most important innovation of this period was the rise of ashigaru, or foot soldiers. Traditional samurai warfare had been dominated by mounted warriors, with infantry playing only a supporting role, but the extended campaigns of the 14th century required larger armies than could be supported by mounted samurai alone. Military leaders began recruiting peasants and lower-class warriors, training them in the use of spears, bows, and eventually firearms. This transformation was gradual and often resisted by traditional samurai, who saw the rise of common foot soldiers as a threat to their social position. But military necessity ultimately prevailed over social prejudice. Armies that included large numbers of disciplined infantry proved more effective than those that relied solely on mounted samurai, especially in siege warfare and defensive campaigns. The changing nature of warfare was reflected in the career of one of the period's most successful military leaders, Kusunoki Masashige. Masashige was a relatively minor provincial warrior who became legendary for his innovative tactics and absolute loyalty to Emperor Go-Daigo. Unlike traditional samurai, who emphasized face-to-face combat and honorable death, Masashige was willing to use any means necessary to achieve victory. His most famous exploit was the defense of Chihaya Castle in 1333. Faced with a vastly superior enemy force, Masashige abandoned conventional defensive tactics and instead relied on guerrilla warfare, surprise attacks, and psychological warfare. He used hidden pits, rolling logs, and boiling water to break up enemy attacks. He launched night raids to keep the besiegers off balance. Most controversially, he was willing to retreat when necessary, preserving his forces for future battles rather than dying gloriously in hopeless stands. These tactics were highly effective, but they also represented a fundamental departure from traditional samurai values. Masashige's willingness to use deception and unconventional methods made him a hero to supporters of the imperial cause, but it also marked him as someone who placed victory above honour. When he finally died in 1336, it was in a conventional battle where his innovative tactics were useless against overwhelming odds. The death of Kusunoki Masashige symbolized the end of one phase of samurai warfare and the beginning of another. The conflicts of the late 14th and early 15th centuries were characterized by larger armies, longer campaigns, and increasingly sophisticated tactics. Individual prowess remained important, but it was now subordinated to strategic and logistical considerations that would have been foreign to earlier generations of warriors. This transformation accelerated during the Muromachi period, when the Ashikaga family established a new shogunate. The Ashikaga were weaker than their Kamakura predecessors, exercising only nominal control over powerful regional lords called daimyo. The result was a political system that was even more decentralized and conflict-prone than before. The weakness of central authority encouraged the development of regional power centers, each controlled by a daimyo who maintained his own army and governed his territory according to his own judgment. These domains became laboratories for military innovation, as competing daimyo experimented with new tactics, new weapons, and new forms of military organization. The most successful of these experiments involved the systematic development of combined arms tactics, integrating mounted samurai, foot soldiers, and eventually firearms into coordinated military forces. The key insight was that different types of troops had different strengths and weaknesses, and that victory depended on using each type effectively while compensating for their limitations. Mounted samurai remained the elite arm of these new armies, but their role changed significantly. Instead of serving as independent champions, they became the mobile striking force of combined arms formations. They were used to exploit breakthroughs created by infantry attacks, to pursue routed enemies, and to provide rapid response to unexpected threats. Foot soldiers, meanwhile, became the backbone of military forces. Armed with long spears called yari, they could form defensive formations that were virtually impregnable to cavalry attack. More importantly, they could be trained more quickly and maintained more cheaply than mounted samurai, allowing daimyo to field larger armies than had ever been possible before. The integration of these different military arms required new approaches to command and control. Traditional samurai warfare had relied on the personal authority of individual leaders and the spontaneous cooperation of warriors who understood their roles intuitively. But coordinating complex formations required systematic planning, clear communication, and disciplined execution of predetermined tactics. This evolution toward more systematic warfare accelerated dramatically in the mid-16th century with the introduction of firearms. Portuguese merchants brought the first European guns to Japan in 1543, and within a few decades, Japanese craftsmen had not only learned to reproduce these weapons, but had begun improving on them. The impact of firearms on samurai warfare was both immediate and profound. Traditional samurai armor, designed to protect against arrows and sword cuts, was largely useless against bullets. Castle fortifications that had been adequate for centuries became obsolete overnight. Most importantly, firearms were weapons that could be mastered by relatively untrained foot soldiers, potentially eliminating the military advantages that had made samurai dominant for so long. But rather than simply adopting European military models, Japanese commanders integrated firearms into their existing tactical systems. They discovered that guns were most effective when used in coordination with traditional weapons, not as replacements for them. Spear-armed infantry could protect gunners from cavalry attack, while the firepower of gunners could break up enemy formations, creating opportunities for spear attacks or cavalry charges. The master of this new form of combined arms warfare was Oda Nobunaga, a daimyo from central Japan who used innovative tactics to build one of the most powerful military forces in Japanese history. Nobunaga understood that success in the new era would require abandoning traditional samurai values in favor of pure military effectiveness. He was willing to use any weapon, any tactic, and any strategy that would bring victory. Nobunaga's most famous victory came in 1575 at the Battle of Nagakuti. His enemy, Takeda Katsuyori, commanded what was considered the finest cavalry force in Japan, mounted warriors whose ancestors had dominated battlefields for centuries. The Takeda cavalry had never been defeated in a major engagement, and conventional wisdom held that no force of foot soldiers could stand against their charges. Nobunaga proved conventional wisdom wrong. He positioned his army behind field fortifications, with alternating ranks of spearmen and gunners. When the Takeda cavalry charged, they were met by disciplined volleys of gunfire that broke their formation before they could reach the spear line. Those who survived the initial volleys found themselves trapped against a wall of spear points, unable to use their traditional weapons effectively. The battle was a massacre. The Takeda cavalry, which had been the terror of central Japan for decades, was essentially destroyed in a single afternoon. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that traditional samurai warfare was becoming obsolete. Individual prowess, martial spirit, and even superior numbers were no match for disciplined troops using coordinated tactics and modern weapons. But Nobunaga's innovations went beyond tactics. He also pioneered new approaches to strategy and logistics that would define warfare for the rest of the samurai period. Instead of relying on seasonal campaigns, he maintained professional armies that could fight year-round. Instead of depending on traditional feudal levies, he recruited soldiers directly, paying them wages and providing their equipment from central supplies. Most controversially, Nobunaga was willing to target non-combatants when military necessity demanded it. His campaign against the Ikoiki, Buddhist communities that had formed their own military organizations, involved the systematic destruction of entire villages and the massacre of thousands of civilians. These tactics were effective, but they violated traditional concepts of honorable warfare so fundamentally that even some of Nobunaga's own followers were appalled. Nobunaga's career was cut short in 1582 when he was betrayed by one of his own generals and forced to commit seppuku, but his innovations were continued and refined by his successors, particularly Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who completed the unification of Japan that Nobunaga had begun. Hideyoshi's military achievements were even more remarkable than Nobunaga's, partly because he had to overcome the disadvantage of humble birth in a society that valued bloodline above all else. Unlike Nobunaga, who had inherited a substantial domain, Hideyoshi rose from the rank of common foot soldier to become the effective ruler of all Japan through pure military and political skill. Hideyoshi's greatest military innovation was his systematic use of siege warfare to reduce enemy strongholds. Instead of attempting costly direct assaults, he would surround enemy castles and starve them into submission, using his superior logistical capabilities to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods. This strategy was time-consuming but highly effective, allowing him to defeat enemies while minimizing his own casualties. The culmination of Hideyoshi's career was his attempt to conquer Korea and China in the 1590s. These campaigns, known as the Imjin War, represented the largest military undertaking in Japanese history to that point. Hideyoshi assembled an invasion force of nearly 160,000 men, transported them across the Korea Strait, and launched what was intended to be the first phase of a campaign that would make him the ruler of East Asia. The initial phase of the Korean invasion was remarkably successful. Japanese forces, experienced from decades of civil war and equipped with superior firearms, swept through Korea with unexpected speed. Seoul fell within 3 weeks, and within 2 months Japanese forces had advanced nearly to the Chinese border. But success brought new challenges. The Japanese found themselves trying to occupy and administer a hostile country whose inhabitants had no intention of accepting foreign rule. Korean irregulars harassed Japanese supply lines, while Chinese armies began moving south to support their Korean allies. Most problematically, Japanese forces found themselves facing the Korean Navy, led by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, whose innovative turtle ships proved devastatingly effective against Japanese transport vessels. The naval war was particularly significant because it demonstrated the limitations of Japanese military innovation. Despite decades of progress in land warfare, the Japanese had neglected naval development. Their ships were designed primarily for transport, not for combat, and they had no answer to Korean innovations like armoured warships and coordinated fleet tactics. The result was a grinding war of attrition that lasted for 6 years and ultimately ended in Japanese withdrawal. The campaigns in Korea were a strategic failure, but they were also a remarkable demonstration of Japanese military capabilities. Despite fighting thousands of miles from home against the combined forces of Korea and China, Japanese armies remained effective and disciplined throughout the conflict. More importantly, the Korean campaigns represented the final evolution of samurai warfare during the medieval period. The armies that fought in Korea were professional forces that combined traditional samurai values with modern military techniques. They included mounted warriors who traced their ancestry back to the Heian period, foot soldiers recruited from the peasantry, and skilled craftsmen who could manufacture and maintain advanced weapons in the field. The death of Hideyoshi in 1598 brought the Korean adventure to an end, but it also created a succession crisis that would lead to the final great battle of the samurai age. The struggle for control of Hideyoshi's legacy was ultimately decided at Sekigahara in 1600, in a battle that would establish the Tokugawa shogunate and usher in a new era of Japanese history. Sekigahara was fought between two coalitions of daimyo, one led by Tokugawa Ieyasu and the other by Ishida Mitsunari. On the surface, it appeared to be a conventional battle between roughly equal forces, each numbering around 80,000 men. But beneath the surface, it was a contest between different visions of how Japan should be governed and, more importantly, different concepts of what samurai warfare should become. Ieyasu represented a conservative vision that emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and careful planning. His forces were well organized, well supplied, and commanded by experienced officers who understood the importance of coordination and timing. Mitsunari's coalition, by contrast, included many daimyo who were motivated more by personal ambition than by loyalty to their nominal leader. The battle itself was decided as much by politics as by tactics. Several key commanders in Mitsunari's army had been secretly negotiating with Ieyasu, and at crucial moments in the fighting, they either failed to engage or actively switched sides. The result was a decisive victory for Ieyasu that established his family as the dominant power in Japan for the next 265 years. But Sekigahara was significant for another reason. It marked the end of the period when military skill alone could determine political authority in Japan. Ieyasu's victory was followed by a systematic reorganization of Japanese society that would eliminate most opportunities for the kind of military advancement that had characterized the previous 4 centuries. The Tokugawa peace that followed Sekigahara created a paradox that would define samurai culture for the rest of its existence. Samurai remained the dominant social class, but they were no longer primarily warriors. Instead, they became administrators, scholars, and ceremonial figures in a society that had little use for their military skills. This transformation began almost immediately after Sekigahara. Ieyasu and his successors implemented a series of policies designed to prevent the kind of warfare that had devastated Japan for centuries. Daimyo were required to maintain residences in Edo and to leave family members there as hostages. Castle construction was strictly regulated. Most importantly, the shogunate maintained a monopoly on foreign relations, preventing any daimyo from acquiring foreign weapons or forming external alliances. These policies were remarkably successful. The Tokugawa period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, was characterized by an almost complete absence of warfare. There were occasional peasant uprisings and minor conflicts, but nothing that resembled the systematic military campaigns of earlier centuries. For the first time in nearly 500 years, Japan was truly at peace. But peace created its own problems. Samurai who had been raised to value martial prowess found themselves in a world where such skills were largely irrelevant. Many adapted by becoming scholars or administrators, developing new expertise in literature, philosophy, and governance. Others maintained their military traditions through ritualized training and theoretical study, preserving techniques that they had no opportunity to use in actual combat. The result was a military culture that became increasingly abstract and ceremonial. Samurai continued to wear swords and to study martial arts, but these activities became more about maintaining social status than about practical military preparation. The elaborate rituals and philosophical principles that had always been part of samurai culture became even more elaborate and complex, partly to compensate for the absence of real warfare. This trend toward abstraction was reinforced by the shogunate's policy of national isolation. After 1633, Japan was effectively closed to foreign contact, with only limited trade allowed through a few carefully controlled ports. This policy prevented the kind of external military challenges that had periodically forced Japanese warriors to adapt their techniques and tactics to new threats. The isolation also meant that Japanese military technology began to lag behind developments in the rest of the world. While European armies were experimenting with new firearms, artillery, and battlefield tactics, Japanese samurai were preserving techniques that had been developed centuries earlier. By the early 19th century, the gap between Japanese and Western military capabilities had become enormous. This gap became apparent in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan with a squadron of American warships. Perry's black ships were equipped with steam engines and modern naval guns that could destroy any Japanese fortification from well beyond the range of traditional weapons. The technological superiority was so overwhelming that Japanese observers described the American ships as floating fortresses that seemed to move by magic. The arrival of Perry's fleet forced Japan to confront a reality that the Tokugawa government had been avoiding for 2 centuries. The outside world had not remained static during Japan's period of isolation. While Japanese samurai had been perfecting the art of swordsmanship and debating the finer points of military philosophy, Western armies had been revolutionizing warfare through the systematic application of industrial technology. The shock of this revelation created a crisis that would ultimately destroy the Tokugawa system and force Japan into a period of rapid modernization. But before examining that final transformation, we need to understand exactly what had happened to samurai warfare during the long peace of the Tokugawa period. The most significant change was the gradual separation of samurai from actual military function. In earlier periods, samurai had been both warriors and landowners, deriving their income from agricultural estates and their status from military service. But the Tokugawa system transformed them into a salaried bureaucracy, paid by their daimyo to perform administrative duties rather than military ones. This transformation was most visible in the great castle towns that became the centres of domain administration. Places like Kanazawa, Sendai, and Kagoshima developed into sophisticated urban centres where thousands of samurai lived in organised neighbourhoods, their daily routines governed by bureaucratic schedules rather than military campaigns. These samurai wore their swords as symbols of rank, not as working tools, and their martial training became increasingly ceremonial. But the ceremonial aspects of samurai culture became extraordinarily elaborate during the Tokugawa period, partly because they served important social and political functions in a peacetime society. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry composition, and other cultural pursuits became as important to samurai identity as sword technique. More significantly, the study of military classics and the practice of martial arts became ways of preserving warrior traditions while adapting them to peaceful circumstances. The most important of these adaptations was the development of what modern scholars call the way of the warrior, or Bushido. This was not a single philosophy, but rather a complex set of ideas about honour, loyalty, and proper conduct that drew on Confucian ethics, Buddhist spirituality, and traditional warrior values. Bushido provided a framework for understanding samurai identity in a world where traditional military functions had largely disappeared. But Bushido was also highly idealized, emphasizing abstract principles rather than practical military considerations. The warrior codes that developed during the Tokugawa period were far more elaborate and restrictive than anything that had existed during the age of active warfare. Real medieval samurai had been pragmatic fighters who adapted their tactics to circumstances, but Tokugawa period samurai were expected to conform to rigid behavioural standards that often had little relationship to military effectiveness. This idealization of warrior culture reached its peak in the 18th century, when scholars began systematically studying and romanticizing the military achievements of earlier periods. The great battles of the Genpei War, the Mongol invasions, and the Sengoku period were transformed into moral lessons about loyalty, courage, and proper conduct. The brutal realities of medieval warfare were sanitized and simplified, creating a mythologized version of samurai history that bore little resemblance to historical fact. The gap between myth and reality became apparent when Japan was forced to modernize its military in response to Western pressure. The samurai who attempted to resist foreign intrusion discovered that centuries of theoretical study and ceremonial practice had not prepared them for actual combat against enemies equipped with modern weapons and trained in contemporary tactics. The first test came in 1863, when the Choshu domain attempted to close the Shimonoseki Strait to foreign shipping. Choshu forces, led by traditional samurai and equipped with obsolete guns, were systematically destroyed by a combined Western fleet. The bombardment lasted only a few hours, but it demonstrated conclusively that traditional Japanese military methods were useless against modern naval power. Similar lessons were learned throughout the 1860s, as various domains attempted to resist foreign pressure through military action. In every case, the result was the same. Japanese forces were defeated quickly and decisively, often suffering casualties that would have been considered catastrophic by the standards of traditional warfare. These defeats forced a fundamental reconsideration of everything that Japanese leaders thought they knew about military affairs. The realization that Japan's military traditions were not just outdated but actively counterproductive created a crisis that extended far beyond purely military concerns. If samurai warfare was obsolete, then what was the basis for samurai political authority? If traditional weapons and tactics were useless, then what was the point of preserving traditional social relationships? The answer that emerged was both radical and conservative. Japan would modernize its military while preserving essential aspects of samurai culture and values. This approach, known as Eastern ethics, Western science, attempted to combine the technological capabilities of the West with the spiritual traditions of Japan. It was an ambitious synthesis that would define Japanese military culture for the next century. The implementation of this synthesis began with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which nominally restored imperial rule, but actually created a new form of government dominated by reform-minded samurai from domains that had opposed the Tokugawa. These reformers understood that Japan's survival as an independent nation required rapid military modernization, but they also believed that Western military techniques could be grafted onto Japanese cultural foundations. The result was a military modernization program that was both remarkably successful and deeply contradictory. Japan created modern armed forces equipped with the latest Western weapons and trained in contemporary tactics. But these forces were also expected to embody traditional samurai values like loyalty, self-sacrifice, and absolute obedience to superior authority. This combination of modern techniques and traditional values was tested in Japan's first major foreign war since the 16th century, the conflict with China in 1894 to 1895. Japanese forces, now equipped with modern rifles, artillery and warships, achieved decisive victories that shocked the world. The speed and completeness of Japan's triumph seemed to validate the synthesis of Eastern and Western military traditions. But the Sino-Japanese War also revealed some disturbing aspects of how traditional samurai values had been adapted to modern warfare. Japanese soldiers were trained to fight with a fanatical disregard for their own safety that impressed foreign observers but also resulted in unnecessarily high casualties. More troubling, the combination of modern weapons with traditional concepts of honor led to atrocities against Chinese civilians that violated contemporary international standards. These problems became even more apparent during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Japanese forces again achieved remarkable success, defeating a major European power for the first time in modern history. But the victory was purchased at enormous cost, both in human lives and in financial resources. The Japanese army's willingness to accept massive casualties in frontal assaults against fortified positions reflected a military culture that valued spiritual factors over tactical considerations. The ultimate test of this modernized samurai warfare came during World War II, when Japan attempted to challenge the combined military power of the United States, Britain and their allies. The initial phases of the Pacific War seemed to validate traditional Japanese military virtues. Japanese forces achieved stunning victories throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific, demonstrating a level of tactical skill, strategic planning, and individual courage that surpassed their enemies' expectations. But these early successes masked fundamental weaknesses that would ultimately prove fatal. The Japanese military had successfully modernized its weapons and tactics, but it had also preserved aspects of traditional samurai culture that were incompatible with 20th century warfare. The emphasis on spiritual factors over material ones, the reluctance to acknowledge tactical mistakes, and the preference for offensive action over defensive planning all contributed to Japan's eventual defeat. The final phase of the Pacific War saw the complete collapse of Japan's military position. American forces, equipped with overwhelming material superiority and trained in flexible tactical methods, systematically destroyed Japanese defenses throughout the Pacific. The Japanese response was to fall back on the most extreme aspects of traditional warrior culture, the kamikaze attacks that characterized the last year of the war. These suicide attacks represented both the ultimate expression of samurai values and their final bankruptcy as a military philosophy. The pilots who flew kamikaze missions embodied the traditional warrior virtues of loyalty, self-sacrifice, and contempt for death. But their attacks, however courageous individually, had no significant impact on the war's outcome. They were gestures of defiance rather than effective military actions. The kamikaze phenomenon also revealed how far Japanese military culture had departed from the pragmatic realism of historical samurai warfare. Medieval warriors had certainly been willing to die for their lords, but they had also understood that death without purpose was wasteful and counterproductive. The samurai who fought at Sekigahara or during the Mongol invasions had been trying to win, not simply to die gloriously. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the Pacific War to an abrupt end, but it also marked the final extinction of samurai warfare as a military system. The weapons that destroyed those cities represented a form of warfare so removed from traditional combat that concepts like individual courage, personal honour, and face-to-face confrontation became completely irrelevant. Japan's surrender in August 1945 was followed by a systematic dismantling of the military culture that had dominated Japanese society for more than 1,000 years. The new constitution adopted in 1947 renounced war as an instrument of national policy, and the Japanese military was replaced by self-defense forces that were explicitly defensive in nature and strictly limited in size and capability. But the end of samurai warfare as a military reality did not mean the end of its cultural influence. The values, aesthetics, and philosophical principles that had developed over centuries of warrior culture continued to shape Japanese society in subtle but important ways. The emphasis on hierarchy, loyalty, and group harmony that had characterized samurai organizations was adapted to corporate and bureaucratic structures. The aesthetic principles that had informed samurai culture influenced everything from industrial design to popular entertainment. Perhaps most significantly, the historical memory of samurai warfare became a source of national identity and cultural pride. The great battles and legendary heroes of Japanese military history were transformed into symbols of national character, representing qualities like perseverance, loyalty, and martial spirit that were seen as essentially Japanese. This romanticized version of samurai history bore little resemblance to the complex and often contradictory reality of warrior culture. The actual samurai had been a diverse group with varying motivations, capabilities, and moral standards. They had been capable of both remarkable heroism and appalling brutality, often within the same campaign or even the same battle. Their military techniques had evolved constantly in response to changing circumstances, and their social and political relationships had been characterized by pragmatic adaptation rather than rigid adherence to abstract principles. But the mythologized samurai of popular culture served important psychological and social functions in modern Japan. They provided a link to a heroic past that seemed more authentic and meaningful than the complexities of contemporary life. They embodied values that many Japanese felt had been lost in the process of modernization and westernization. Most importantly, they offered a way of understanding Japanese uniqueness that did not depend on contemporary political or economic achievements. The global fascination with samurai culture that developed in the late 20th century reflected similar needs and concerns. In an increasingly complex and interconnected world, the image of the solitary warrior governed by a strict code of honor appealed to people who felt overwhelmed by modern life's ambiguities and moral compromises. The samurai became symbols of authenticity, spiritual discipline, and moral clarity that transcended their specific historical context. But this global popularization of samurai culture also distorted historical understanding even further. The samurai of movies, television, and popular fiction were even more idealized and simplified than their Japanese counterparts. They became universal symbols of warrior virtue rather than specific products of particular historical circumstances. Understanding the real history of samurai warfare requires moving beyond these romantic stereotypes to examine the complex interactions of military technology, social organization, political authority, and cultural values that shaped Japanese society for more than a millennium. It means recognizing that samurai were not timeless embodiments of universal warrior virtues, but rather specific responses to specific historical challenges. The 1,000-year history of samurai warfare reveals several important patterns that extend beyond Japanese history. First, it demonstrates how military cultures develop their own internal logic and momentum, often persisting long after the circumstances that created them have changed. The elaborate rituals and philosophical principles that characterized later samurai culture were responses to military challenges that no longer existed, but they continued to shape behavior and thinking for centuries. Second, the samurai experience illustrates the difficulty of adapting traditional military cultures to modern warfare. The Japanese military's attempts to combine Eastern values with Western techniques were partially successful, But they also created internal contradictions that ultimately proved devastating. The tension between spiritual and material factors, between individual heroism and collective discipline, and between traditional honour and modern effectiveness was never fully resolved. Finally, the history of samurai warfare shows how military traditions can be transformed into cultural resources that serve entirely different functions. The samurai values that had developed for specific military purposes were adapted to serve as sources of personal identity, social organisation, and national character long after they had lost their original military relevance. The story of samurai warfare is ultimately a story about adaptation and transformation. The warriors who emerged from the eastern provinces in the 9th century were responses to specific administrative and military challenges facing the imperial government. The mounted archers who dominated battlefields in the 12th century were products of particular technological and tactical circumstances. The disciplined formations that fought in Korea in the 1590s reflected centuries of military evolution and innovation. Each generation of samurai adapted their techniques, tactics, and values to meet the challenges they faced. The process was continuous and often unconscious, driven more by practical necessity than by theoretical consideration. The result was a military culture that was simultaneously conservative and innovative, traditional and adaptive. This adaptability was both the greatest strength and the ultimate limitation of samurai warfare. It allowed Japanese military culture to survive and evolve through centuries of changing circumstances, but it also created internal contradictions that became increasingly difficult to resolve. When the challenges became too great and the contradictions too severe, the system collapsed with remarkable suddenness. The final irony of samurai warfare is that its greatest cultural impact came after its military function had ended. The values and aesthetics that had developed for practical military purposes found new life as sources of meaning and identity in a peaceful world. The warriors who had once fought with swords and arrows became symbols of spiritual discipline and moral integrity for people who had never experienced combat. In the end, the 1,000-year history of samurai warfare is not just a military story, but a human one. It is about how people create meaning through conflict, how they adapt to changing circumstances, and how they preserve what they value most even when the world around them is transformed beyond recognition. The samurai are gone, but the human needs that created them remain, and so their story continues to resonate across cultures and centuries. The techniques they developed, the values they championed, and the contradictions they embodied are all part of the complex legacy of organised violence in human society. Understanding their history helps us understand not just medieval Japan, but the broader patterns of how human beings organise themselves for war, and how military cultures shape the societies that create them. The sound of steel on steel, the thunder of horses' hooves, the whispered prayers before battle, these are echoes from a world that no longer exists. But they are also reminders of capacities for both nobility and brutality that remain part of human nature. The samurai fought their last battle more than a century and a half ago, but the questions they faced about honour, loyalty, and the proper use of violence are questions that every generation must answer for itself. Their 1,000 years of warfare ended not with a climactic battle, but with a quiet surrender, not with a heroic charge, but with a bureaucratic reorganisation. It was, perhaps, the most samurai-like ending possible, an acceptance that circumstances had changed beyond what individual courage or traditional wisdom could address, and that survival required adaptation rather than resistance. In that final transformation, the samurai demonstrated one last time the pragmatic flexibility that had always been their greatest strength, even when it was hidden beneath layers of ritual and philosophy. They had begun as practical solutions to administrative problems and had evolved into symbols of cultural identity. In the end, they chose cultural survival over military glory, ensuring that something of their legacy would endure even after their swords had been put away forever. But to truly understand what was lost when samurai warfare ended, we need to examine more closely the specific techniques, rituals, and relationships that made this military culture unique. The surface elements, the armour, the swords, the dramatic gestures, were only the visible manifestations of a complex system that governed everything from individual combat to strategic planning. Consider, for instance, the seemingly simple act of mounting a horse for battle. A modern cavalry officer might accomplish this in seconds, but for a medieval samurai, It was a ritual that could take several minutes and involved dozens of specific movements, each with its own significance. The warrior would first purify himself with water, then don his armor in a precise sequence that reflected both practical necessity and spiritual preparation. The mounting itself was performed according to strict protocols that indicated the warrior's rank, experience, and the nature of his mission. This attention to ritual detail extended to every aspect of samurai warfare. The stringing of a bow was not simply a mechanical preparation, but a meditative exercise that connected the archer to generations of predecessors. The selection of arrows for different types of targets involved considerations that were simultaneously practical and symbolic. Even the manner in which a warrior held his reins while riding to battle conveyed information about his intentions, his confidence, and his social position. These rituals served multiple functions that are not immediately obvious to modern observers. On a practical level, they ensured that complex military procedures were performed correctly under the stress of combat. Ritual standardization meant that warriors from different domains could cooperate effectively even if they had never fought together before. More subtly, the ritual elements helped warriors manage the psychological challenges of combat by providing familiar patterns of behavior that could be followed even when conscious thought was compromised by fear or excitement. The psychological dimension of samurai warfare was particularly sophisticated, reflecting centuries of accumulated wisdom about the mental challenges of organized violence. Medieval Japanese warriors understood that combat effectiveness depended as much on mental state as on physical preparation. They developed elaborate techniques for cultivating the proper mindset for battle, ranging from meditation practices derived from Buddhism to visualization exercises that prepared warriors for specific tactical scenarios. One of the most important of these mental preparations was the cultivation of what Japanese called the acceptance of death. This was not simply fatalism or reckless disregard for personal safety, but rather a psychological technique for eliminating the hesitation and self-doubt that could prove fatal in combat. Warriors who had genuinely accepted the possibility of death were free to focus entirely on tactical execution without being distracted by considerations of personal survival. This mental discipline was reinforced by elaborate ceremonies that took place before major battles. Warriors would gather to compose death poems, make final arrangements for their families, and perform rituals that symbolically severed their attachments to earthly concerns. These ceremonies served practical purposes. They ensured that administrative details were handled before battle, but they also created a shared psychological state that bound individual warriors together into an effective fighting unit. The bonds created through these shared experiences were extraordinarily powerful. Modern military psychologists have documented the importance of unit cohesion in combat effectiveness, but samurai warfare took this principle to extraordinary lengths. Warriors who fought together developed relationships that extended far beyond mere professional cooperation. They became, in effect, an extended family bound together by shared risks, shared values, and shared understanding of their place in a cosmic order that extended beyond individual existence. These relationships were maintained through an elaborate system of mutual obligations that governed every aspect of samurai life. A warrior's loyalty to his immediate superior was absolute, but it was also reciprocal. Lords who failed to protect their followers, provide for their families, or respect their honor could legitimately be abandoned. The system was hierarchical, but it was not arbitrary. Power came with responsibilities that were taken seriously by all parties. The complexity of these relationships becomes apparent when we examine specific historical cases. Consider the situation of Kusunoki Masashige during his defense of Chihaya Castle. Masashige was fighting for Emperor Go-Daigo, but his immediate followers were bound to him personally rather than to the imperial cause. When Masashige decided to employ unconventional tactics that violated traditional concepts of honourable warfare, he had to persuade his followers that loyalty to him required abandoning their own preferences for conventional combat. This was not simply a matter of issuing orders. Samurai were not mindless automatons who obeyed without question. They were intelligent, often highly educated warriors who expected their leaders to justify their decisions according to shared values and principles. Masashige's success depended on his ability to demonstrate that his unconventional tactics served higher purposes that his followers could understand and accept. The persuasion process involved extensive discussion, often conducted according to formal protocols that ensured every participant could express their views. These military councils were not democratic in the modern sense. but they were consultative. A wise leader listened carefully to his followers' concerns and modified his plans accordingly. A leader who consistently ignored advice, or who made decisions that his followers considered dishonourable, would soon find himself without an army. This system of consultative leadership had both strengths and weaknesses. On the positive side, it ensured that military decisions reflected the collective wisdom of experienced warriors rather than the whims of individual commanders. It also created a level of commitment to shared decisions that was difficult to achieve through simple authoritarian command. Warriors who had participated in planning a battle were far more likely to execute their roles effectively than those who were simply following orders they didn't understand. But the system also created delays and complications that could prove costly in rapidly changing tactical situations. The time required for consultation was not always available during active campaigns. More seriously, the need to maintain consensus could prevent leaders from making necessary but unpopular decisions. The requirement that all actions be justifiable according to shared values could restrict tactical flexibility in situations where conventional approaches were inadequate. These tensions between collective wisdom and individual authority became increasingly problematic as warfare became more complex and fast-paced. The introduction of firearms, in particular, created tactical situations that required rapid decision-making and precise coordination of different types of troops. Traditional consultative methods were poorly suited to managing combined arms formations, where split-second timing could determine the difference between victory and defeat. The solution that emerged during the Sengoku period was a hybrid system that combined traditional consultation with more centralized command structures. Successful leaders like Oda Nobunaga learned to use traditional methods for strategic planning while reserving tactical decisions for themselves and their immediate subordinates. This approach preserved the psychological benefits of participatory decision-making while allowing for the rapid responses that modern warfare required. But this evolution toward more centralized command came at a cost. The older system had created armies that were held together by genuine shared commitment to common purposes. The newer system created more efficient military organizations, but ones that depended more heavily on the authority and competence of individual leaders. When those leaders made mistakes, or when they were removed from the picture, their armies could collapse with startling rapidity. The vulnerability of centralized command became apparent during the final phases of the Sengoku period, when the deaths of key leaders repeatedly created succession crises that paralyzed entire military organizations. The death of Oda Nobunaga in 1582 led to immediate conflicts among his subordinates that nearly destroyed everything he had built. The death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598 created the power vacuum that eventually led to the Battle of Sekigahara and the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate. These succession crises revealed a fundamental problem with military organizations that were built around individual authority rather than institutional structures. Traditional samurai warfare had been based on personal relationships that could survive the death of individual leaders because they were distributed throughout the organization. But the more efficient command structures of the late Sengoku period concentrated authority in ways that made them extremely vulnerable to disruption. The Tokugawa solved this problem by essentially eliminating the conditions that made military effectiveness necessary. By ending warfare, they removed the pressures that had forced military organizations to become more centralized and efficient. Samurai could return to the older, more consultative methods of organization because they no longer needed to respond rapidly to changing battlefield conditions. But this solution created its own problems. Military organizations that were not regularly tested in actual combat gradually lost their effectiveness. The elaborate procedures and rituals that had once served practical purposes became increasingly divorced from military reality. By the 19th century, many samurai military exercises had become so stylized and predictable that they bore little resemblance to actual warfare. This disconnect between training and reality became apparent when Japan was forced to modernize its military in response to Western pressure. Samurai who had spent decades perfecting traditional martial arts discovered that their skills were largely irrelevant to modern warfare. Worse, the mental habits that traditional training had cultivated were often counterproductive in combat situations that required rapid adaptation to unfamiliar circumstances. The problem was not simply that traditional weapons were obsolete, though that was certainly true. The deeper issue was that traditional training methods had been designed to produce warriors who could function effectively within a known system of rules and expectations. Modern warfare, by contrast, required soldiers who could adapt quickly to situations that had no precedent and that could not be addressed through traditional methods. This adaptability problem was compounded by the social changes that had occurred during the Tokugawa period. The samurai who attempted to resist foreign intrusion in the 1860s were not the practical warriors of earlier centuries, but rather hereditary members of a privileged class who had been educated to value form over function and tradition over innovation. Many had never experienced actual combat, and their understanding of warfare was based more on literary sources than on practical experience. The contrast with their medieval predecessors was stark. The samurai who had fought during the Genpei War or the Mongol invasions had been tested repeatedly in life-and-death situations that rewarded practical effectiveness over theoretical knowledge. They had developed their techniques through trial and error, discarding what didn't work and refining what did. Most importantly, they had understood that survival depended on their ability to adapt to new challenges rather than on their adherence to traditional forms. This practical flexibility had always been the true strength of samurai warfare, even when it was hidden beneath layers of ritual and ceremony. The great victories of samurai history had been achieved not by rigid adherence to traditional methods, but by creative adaptation of those methods to specific circumstances. Minamoto no Yoshitsune's victory at Ichinotani succeeded because he ignored traditional concepts of honourable warfare in favour of tactical effectiveness. Oda Nobunaga's dominance of central Japan was based on his willingness to abandon traditional approaches in favour of whatever methods worked. But by the 19th century, this tradition of practical adaptation had been largely lost. The samurai class had become so invested in preserving traditional forms that they had forgotten the underlying principles that had made those forms effective. They had mistaken the external trappings of warrior culture for its essential spirit, and in doing so, they had made themselves incapable of responding effectively to genuinely new challenges. The tragedy of 19th century samurai resistance movements was not that they failed. Failure was inevitable, given the overwhelming technological superiority of their opponents, but that they failed to understand why they were failing. Instead of recognizing that their methods were inadequate and adapting accordingly, they concluded that they simply needed to apply traditional methods more intensely. The result was a series of increasingly desperate and futile gestures that accomplished nothing except to demonstrate the complete bankruptcy of traditional approaches. This pattern of escalating futility reached its climax during World War II, when Japanese military leaders convinced themselves that spiritual factors could overcome material disadvantages that were orders of magnitude greater than anything faced by traditional samurai. The kamikaze attacks that characterized the final phase of the Pacific War were the logical culmination of a worldview that had lost touch with the practical realities that had originally shaped samurai warfare. The irony is that the qualities that made samurai warfare effective in its original context, flexibility, pragmatism, and willingness to adapt, were precisely the qualities that their 20th century successors most conspicuously lacked. The modern Japanese military had preserved the external forms of samurai culture while abandoning the internal logic that had made those forms meaningful. This transformation of warrior culture from practical necessity to cultural symbol was not unique to Japan. Similar patterns can be observed throughout history whenever military traditions outlived the circumstances that created them. The chivalric ideals of medieval Europe underwent a comparable transformation, becoming increasingly elaborate and divorced from military reality as the military technologies and social structures that had originally shaped them became obsolete. But the Japanese case was particularly dramatic because of the speed and completeness of the transformation. In less than 3 centuries, samurai culture evolved from a practical military system to an elaborate cultural performance that retained the external appearance of warrior tradition while losing most of its functional content. The process was accelerated by Japan's policy of isolation, which prevented the kind of external challenges that might have forced continued adaptation and evolution. The end result was a military culture that was simultaneously highly sophisticated and completely anachronistic. The ritual elements, philosophical principles, and social relationships that characterized Tokugawa period samurai culture were extraordinarily complex and refined. They represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about human nature, social organization, and the management of violence. But they were wisdom about problems that no longer existed, and they provided little guidance for dealing with the challenges that actually faced 19th century Japan. This disconnect between cultural sophistication and practical relevance was perhaps the most profound tragedy of samurai warfare's long decline. The tradition that had once produced some of history's most effective military innovations had become an obstacle to the very kind of innovative thinking that its own origins represented. The culture that had celebrated adaptability had become rigidly traditional. The warriors who had once prized effectiveness above form had become obsessed with preserving forms that had lost their effectiveness. Understanding this transformation is crucial for understanding not just Japanese history, but the broader patterns by which human cultures adapt to changing circumstances. Military traditions are particularly vulnerable to this kind of dysfunction because their effectiveness can only be tested under conditions that societies naturally try to avoid. Unlike economic or technological systems, which are constantly tested by daily use, military systems can persist for long periods without any meaningful evaluation of their continued relevance. The samurai experience suggests that military cultures are most likely to remain effective when they are regularly challenged by genuinely threatening opponents who force continuous adaptation and innovation. The periods when samurai warfare was most dynamic and effective, the early Heian period, the Genpei War, the Mongol invasions, the Sengoku period, were all characterized by intense competition and frequent combat that rewarded innovation and punished adherence to obsolete methods. Conversely, the periods when samurai culture became most rigid and ineffective were characterized by peace and isolation that eliminated the external pressures that had originally shaped the tradition. The Tokugawa period was peaceful and stable, which were significant achievements in themselves, but peace and stability also created conditions that allowed military culture to evolve in directions that had little relationship to military effectiveness. This pattern has implications that extend far beyond military history. It suggests that all human institutions, political, economic, social, and cultural, require regular challenges to remain effective. Institutions that are protected from testing and competition tend to become increasingly elaborate and self-referential, losing touch with the external purposes they were originally designed to serve. The samurai tradition ultimately survived its military obsolescence by transforming itself into something entirely different, a cultural resource that provided meaning, identity, and inspiration for people who had no direct connection to its original military functions. This transformation was successful in its own terms, but it also represented a fundamental break with everything that had made samurai warfare historically significant. The warrior who charged across the fields of Sekigahara in 1600 and the salaryman who practices kendo in modern Tokyo are connected by historical continuity, but they inhabit completely different worlds with completely different challenges and completely different understandings of what it means to be a warrior. The connection between them is real, but it is primarily symbolic rather than functional. This symbolic connection has proven remarkably durable and influential, shaping not only Japanese culture, but global understanding of what warrior traditions represent. The samurai have become universal symbols of discipline, honor, and spiritual development, transcending their specific historical context to become part of humanity's shared cultural vocabulary. But this universalization has also completed the process of separation from historical reality that began during the Tokugawa period. The samurai of popular culture are even more idealized and simplified than their Tokugawa period predecessors, representing abstract virtues rather than complex human beings struggling with difficult and often contradictory demands. The real samurai were neither the noble heroes of popular romance nor the brutal fanatics of their harshest critics. They were human beings operating within specific historical circumstances that required them to balance competing demands and contradictory values. They were capable of remarkable courage and appalling cruelty, often within the same campaign or even the same battle. They created military innovations that changed the course of history, but they also preserved traditions that eventually became obstacles to further innovation. Their 1,000-year history reveals the complexity of human adaptation to the challenges of organized violence. It shows how military cultures develop, evolve, and eventually become obsolete. But it also shows how the values and relationships forged in military contexts can survive and influence societies long after their original purposes have been forgotten. Most importantly, the samurai experience demonstrates that military effectiveness and cultural sophistication are not the same thing. A military tradition can be highly refined, philosophically sophisticated, and culturally influential, while being completely useless for its ostensible purpose. Conversely, military innovations that prove highly effective often emerge from sources that established military cultures regard as crude, dishonourable, or illegitimate. The tension between effectiveness and honour that characterised samurai warfare throughout its history was never fully resolved, and perhaps it could not be resolved. The demands of practical military effectiveness and the requirements of cultural meaning-making often point in different directions, and attempts to satisfy both simultaneously can result in systems that serve neither purpose particularly well. In the end, the samurai chose cultural meaning over military effectiveness, and perhaps that was the wisest choice available to them. Their military traditions had become obsolete, but the values and relationships they had developed retained relevance for human concerns that transcended warfare. By preserving what could be preserved and allowing what had become dysfunctional to fade away, they ensured that something of their legacy would survive even the complete transformation of the world that had created them. The story of samurai warfare thus becomes a meditation on adaptation, survival, and the persistence of human values across changing circumstances. It reminds us that all human institutions are temporary, but that the human needs they serve are enduring. The forms change, often dramatically, but the underlying search for meaning, purpose, and connection continues across generations and cultures. The echo of steel on steel has faded, but the echo of human aspiration remains. To truly grasp the magnitude of what was lost when samurai warfare ended, we must venture into the intimate details of how these warriors actually lived, fought, and died. The grand sweeps of history tell us about battles won and lost, but they cannot capture the texture of daily life for men whose entire existence revolved around the possibility of violent death. Consider a typical day in the life of a samurai during the height of the Sengoku period. He would wake before dawn, not to the gentle sounds of nature, but to the calculated awareness that each day might be his last. His first act upon waking was not to stretch or yawn, but to touch the hilt of his sword, a gesture so automatic that most samurai performed it unconsciously. This simple movement served multiple purposes. It confirmed that his weapon was within reach, it reconnected him to his martial identity, and it reminded him of the responsibilities that came with his status. The morning ablutions of a samurai were elaborate affairs that combined practical hygiene with spiritual preparation. Water was not simply for washing, it was for purification. The act of cleaning one's body was simultaneously an act of preparing one's soul for whatever challenges the day might bring. Hair was not simply combed, it was arranged according to complex protocols that indicated rank, age, and current circumstances. A warrior heading into battle wore his hair differently than one attending a formal ceremony, and these differences were immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with warrior culture. The process of donning armor was perhaps the most complex ritual in a samurai's daily routine. A full set of samurai armor could consist of more than 50 separate pieces, each with its own proper position and method of attachment. But this was not simply a matter of putting on protective equipment. The order in which pieces were donned, the prayers spoken during the process, and the assistance provided by retainers all carried deep symbolic meaning. The process typically began with undergarments that were themselves elaborate constructions. The fundoshi, or loincloth, was wrapped according to specific patterns that were believed to provide spiritual as well as physical protection. Over this went layers of padded clothing designed to prevent chafing from the armour, but also arranged according to aesthetic principles that reflected the warrior's taste and status. Even these invisible layers of clothing were opportunities for artistic expression and personal statement. The armour itself was a masterwork of functional art. Each piece was individually crafted to fit its owner's body precisely, and the decoration applied to the surface told a story about the wearer's identity, achievements, and aspirations. The colours chosen, the family crests displayed, and the motifs incorporated all conveyed information that could be read by anyone familiar with the visual language of warrior culture. But perhaps most importantly, the armour served as a psychological transition device. The process of putting on armour transformed an ordinary human being into a warrior prepared to face death. Each piece added to the armour was simultaneously a piece of ordinary humanity set aside. By the time the process was complete, the man inside the armour had become something different, a creature capable of killing and dying without hesitation. The weapons that completed a samurai's equipment were equally complex in their symbolism and significance. The famous katana was not simply a tool for cutting, it was a spiritual object that embodied the soul of its owner. The process of selecting, maintaining, and using these weapons involved rituals and traditions that had been refined over centuries. The relationship between a samurai and his sword was perhaps the most intimate bond in warrior culture. The sword was not an external tool that could be picked up and discarded at will. It was an extension of the warrior's body and spirit. Master swordsmiths were revered almost like religious figures, and the creation of a fine blade was considered a sacred act that required spiritual as well as technical preparation. The daily maintenance of weapons was itself a form of meditation. The careful cleaning, oiling, and sharpening required by samurai weapons could not be rushed or performed carelessly. The process demanded complete attention and perfect technique, creating a focused mental state that prepared the warrior for combat while simultaneously maintaining the tools that his life might depend on. But weapons were only part of the complex system that enabled samurai warfare. Equally important were the horses that carried mounted warriors into battle. The relationship between a samurai and his horse was almost as intimate as the relationship with his weapons, and it required years to develop properly. Samurai horses were not simply transportation. They were partners in combat who needed to understand and respond to their riders' intentions without verbal commands. The training required to create such partnerships was extraordinarily demanding for both horse and rider. Horses had to learn to respond to subtle shifts in their riders' weight and posture, while remaining calm in the chaos of battle. Riders had to develop the balance and coordination necessary to shoot accurately while controlling a moving horse with their knees and feet. The care and feeding of war horses was a major logistical challenge that shaped many aspects of samurai culture. Horses required enormous amounts of food, water, and shelter, resources that were not always available during extended campaigns. The need to provide for horses influenced strategic planning, determined the routes that armies could take, and often decided when and where battles could be fought. More subtly, the dependence on horses created social relationships that extended far beyond the individual warrior. Each warhorse represented a significant investment that few samurai could afford individually. Horses were often provided by lords to their retainers, creating bonds of obligation that reinforced the feudal relationships that held samurai society together. The loss of a horse in battle was not just a tactical setback, it was a financial disaster that could impoverish a warrior family for generations. The economics of samurai warfare were far more complex than popular culture suggests. The image of the lone warrior living by his sword is romantic, but it bears little relationship to historical reality. Samurai warfare was an enormously expensive enterprise that required sophisticated systems of production, distribution, and finance. The cost of maintaining a single mounted warrior was equivalent to the annual production of several peasant families. The armour alone could cost as much as a substantial house, and it required regular maintenance by skilled craftsmen who commanded high fees for their services. Weapons were similarly expensive, particularly the finest blades that were considered essential for a warrior's reputation and effectiveness. Beyond personal equipment, samurai warfare required elaborate support systems that are often invisible in popular accounts. Every mounted warrior needed several attendants to maintain his equipment, care for his horse, and assist with the countless details that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. These attendants were not mere servants. They were skilled professionals whose expertise was essential to military effectiveness. The feeding of armies was an even greater challenge. A force of several thousand warriors, along with their horses and attendants, could consume the entire agricultural surplus of a province in a matter of weeks. The logistical systems required to supply major campaigns were among the most sophisticated organizational achievements of medieval Japan, involving networks of suppliers, transporters, and administrators that spanned hundreds of miles. These economic realities shaped every aspect of samurai warfare, from the tactics used in individual battles to the grand strategies pursued by major daimyo. Campaigns had to be planned around the availability of supplies, and battles often had to be fought at times and places determined more by logistical convenience than by tactical advantage. The financial pressures of warfare also created complex relationships between military and civilian society. Peasants provided not only the agricultural surplus that fed armies, but also many of the specialized products that warfare required. Swordsmiths, armorers, horse trainers, and countless other craftsmen depended on military demand for their livelihoods, while their skills were essential to military effectiveness. These economic relationships were not simply matters of supply and demand. They were embedded in social structures that defined the roles and obligations of different classes within samurai society. Peasants were expected to provide not only material support but also manpower for military campaigns. Craftsmen were bound to their samurai patrons by relationships that combined economic dependence with personal loyalty. The complexity of these relationships becomes apparent when we examine specific historical cases. During Oda Nobunaga's campaigns to unify central Japan, his success depended as much on his ability to manage complex supply chains as on his tactical innovations on the battlefield. Nobunaga's armies were fed by agricultural surpluses extracted from conquered territories, equipped with weapons produced in workshops under his direct control, and transported by networks of roads and waterways that he had systematically developed. But Nobunaga's system also depended on his ability to maintain the loyalty of thousands of individuals whose cooperation was essential to military success. Peasants had to be convinced to provide surplus production rather than simply consuming it themselves. Craftsmen had to be persuaded to prioritize military production over more profitable civilian markets. Local administrators had to be trusted to collect and distribute resources without embezzling them for personal gain. This web of relationships was held together by a combination of incentives and threats that reflected the complex psychology of feudal society. Loyalty was rewarded with grants of land, prestigious positions, and protection from enemies. Disloyalty was punished with loss of status, confiscation of property, and in extreme cases, death. But the system also depended on shared values and beliefs that made cooperation seem natural and inevitable rather than coerced. The ideological foundations of samurai society were as important as its economic and military structures. The warrior culture that dominated medieval Japan was supported by sophisticated philosophical and religious systems that provided meaning and justification for what might otherwise seem like organized brutality. Buddhism in particular played a crucial role in shaping samurai attitudes toward violence and death. The Buddhist concept of impermanence helped warriors accept the possibility of death without being paralyzed by fear. The Buddhist emphasis on detachment from worldly concerns enabled warriors to fight effectively without being distracted by thoughts of personal gain or loss. Most importantly, Buddhist ideas about karma and rebirth provided a framework for understanding violence that made it seem part of a larger cosmic order rather than simple human brutality. But the Buddhism that influenced samurai culture was not the pacifist philosophy that many modern observers associate with the religion. Instead, it was a warrior Buddhism that had been adapted to the needs and circumstances of a military society. Buddhist temples often served as military fortresses. Buddhist monks sometimes fought as warriors, and Buddhist teachings were interpreted in ways that justified violence when it served higher purposes. The adaptation of Buddhism to warrior culture was neither accidental nor superficial. It reflected centuries of theological and philosophical work by scholar monks who understood that their religion needed to address the practical and spiritual needs of a society organized around warfare. The result was a sophisticated synthesis that preserved the essential insights of Buddhism while making them relevant to the experiences of professional warriors. Similar adaptations occurred with Confucian ideas about social order, loyalty, and proper behavior. Confucian concepts of hierarchical relationships provided a framework for understanding the complex web of obligations that held samurai society together. Confucian emphasis on education and self-cultivation encouraged warriors to develop intellectual as well as martial skills. Most importantly, Confucian ideas about the relationship between individual virtue and social order provided a way of understanding warfare as something more than mere competition for power. The synthesis of these different philosophical and religious traditions created a worldview that was uniquely suited to the needs of a warrior society. It provided meaning and purpose for lives that might otherwise seem dedicated solely to violence. It created frameworks for making moral judgments in situations where conventional ethics might provide little guidance. Most importantly, it established standards of behavior that could be maintained even under the extreme pressures of combat. These standards were not simply abstract philosophical principles. They were practical guidelines that governed everything from individual combat to strategic planning. The concept of honor, for instance, was not merely a romantic ideal. It was a functional system for managing relationships and resolving conflicts within a society where violence was always a possibility. The practical importance of honor becomes apparent when we examine how disputes were resolved in samurai society. Conflicts that might be handled through legal procedures in other societies were often settled through ritualized combat in samurai culture. But these combats were not simply tests of martial skill. They were complex social performances that involved elaborate rules about proper behavior, acceptable tactics, and appropriate outcomes. A typical challenge to single combat began long before the actual fighting started. The challenger had to follow specific protocols for issuing the challenge, including formal statements about the nature of the dispute and the terms under which combat would be conducted. The challenged party had similar obligations to respond appropriately, either by accepting the challenge or by finding honourable ways to avoid combat. Once combat was agreed upon, both parties were bound by complex rules about weapons, tactics, and behaviour. These rules were not simply matters of etiquette. They served important functions in maintaining social order. They ensured that disputes were resolved in ways that minimised collateral damage to innocent parties. They provided frameworks for determining winners and losers that were widely accepted as legitimate. Most importantly, they created procedures that allowed conflicts to be resolved without destroying the relationships that held society together. The complexity of these rules becomes apparent when we examine specific historical duels. The famous encounter between Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro on Ganryu Island in 1612 was not simply a fight between two skilled swordsmen. It was a carefully orchestrated social event that involved months of preparation, elaborate negotiations about terms and conditions, and formal procedures that were designed to ensure that the outcome would be accepted as legitimate by all parties. But individual combat was only one aspect of the complex honour system that governed samurai behaviour. Equally important were the codes that governed conduct in larger military engagements. These codes addressed questions about legitimate targets, acceptable tactics, proper treatment of prisoners, and appropriate behaviour towards civilians. The practical importance of these codes becomes apparent when we examine how they influenced actual military campaigns. During the Mongol invasions, for instance, Japanese commanders had to decide whether to employ tactics that violated traditional concepts of honourable warfare. The decision to abandon individual challenges in favour of coordinated group attacks was not simply a tactical choice. It was a cultural revolution that required fundamental changes in how warriors understood their roles and responsibilities. Similar dilemmas arose throughout samurai history whenever military necessity conflicted with traditional concepts of proper behaviour. The introduction of firearms created particularly difficult problems, since guns could kill from distances that made individual recognition impossible and at ranges that prevented the kind of face-to-face encounters that traditional honour codes assumed. The resolution of these dilemmas was never simple or complete. Different commanders reached different conclusions about how to balance military effectiveness against traditional values, and these differences often created conflicts within the samurai class itself. Some warriors embraced innovations that improved their chances of victory, while others insisted that certain standards could not be compromised regardless of tactical advantages. These internal conflicts were particularly intense during periods of rapid change, such as the late Sengoku period when new technologies and tactics were being introduced at an unprecedented pace. The samurai who served Oda Nobunaga, for instance, had to reconcile their traditional values with their lord's willingness to use any means necessary to achieve victory. Some made this adjustment successfully, while others found the contradictions unbearable and sought service with more traditional commanders. The psychological strain of these contradictions was enormous. Warriors who had been raised to value individual prowess found themselves serving in armies where collective discipline was more important than personal skill. Warriors who had been taught that honourable death was preferable to shameful defeat found themselves expected to survive and fight another day regardless of immediate circumstances. The human cost of these transitions is visible in the personal accounts that survive from the period. Warriors wrote poems about their confusion and despair as traditional certainties dissolved around them. Some found ways to adapt traditional values to new circumstances, while others retreated into increasingly rigid adherence to outdated practices. But perhaps the most poignant accounts come from warriors who understood that their world was ending, but who continued to fight according to principles they knew were obsolete. These men were not stupid or fanatical. They were intelligent individuals who had made conscious choices to preserve what they valued most, even when doing so guaranteed their defeat. The final battles of the Sengoku period were full of such tragic figures. warriors who fought with outdated weapons against modern armies, commanders who insisted on traditional tactics against enemies who had abandoned such constraints, and entire clans who chose destruction rather than compromise with a world they no longer recognized. These tragedies were repeated on an even larger scale during the Meiji Restoration, when traditional samurai found themselves confronting not just new military technologies but an entirely different conception of what society should be. The samurai rebellions of the 1870s were not simply military campaigns. They were desperate attempts to preserve a way of life that had become incompatible with the modern world. The most famous of these rebellions, led by Saigo Takamori in 1877, demonstrated both the nobility and the futility of trying to preserve traditional warrior values in a world that no longer had room for them. Saigo's forces fought with extraordinary courage and discipline, but they were hopelessly outmatched by government armies equipped with modern weapons and trained in contemporary tactics. The final battle of the Satsuma Rebellion, fought at Shirayama, was a perfect microcosm of the larger tragedy of samurai warfare's end. A few hundred traditional warriors, armed with swords and obsolete firearms, made a desperate charge against thousands of government soldiers equipped with modern rifles and artillery. The outcome was never in doubt, but the rebels fought anyway, dying not for victory, but for the preservation of principles they valued more than life itself. The death of Saigo Takamori at Shirayama marked the end of samurai warfare as a military reality, but it also marked the beginning of samurai warfare as a cultural myth. The courage displayed by Saigo and his followers became a model for later generations of Japanese who faced their own seemingly impossible challenges. The values they died for became symbols of spiritual strength that transcended their specific historical context. This transformation of military defeat into cultural victory was perhaps the most remarkable achievement of samurai culture. By choosing to fight for principles rather than for practical goals, the last samurai created a legacy that proved more durable than any military victory could have been. They demonstrated that some things were worth preserving even at the cost of everything else, and in doing so, they provided inspiration for future generations who would face their own tests of character and commitment. The mythologization of the last samurai also served important psychological functions for a society undergoing rapid and traumatic change. The modernization of Japan required abandoning many traditional ways of life, and this process created profound anxiety and uncertainty about national identity. The image of warriors who remained true to their principles despite hopeless odds provided reassurance that essential Japanese values could survive even the most dramatic social transformations. But this mythologization also distorted historical understanding in ways that continue to influence contemporary perceptions of samurai culture. The emphasis on heroic last stands obscured the more complex reality of how most samurai actually adapted to changing circumstances. The focus on dramatic final battles ignored the gradual processes by which warrior culture was transformed into other forms of social organization. Most importantly, the romanticization of samurai warfare created a simplified version of warrior culture that emphasized its most dramatic elements while ignoring its internal contradictions and practical complexities. The real samurai had been struggling with tensions between individual and collective values, between traditional and innovative approaches, and between military effectiveness and cultural meaning for centuries before their final defeat. These struggles were not signs of weakness or confusion. They were natural responses to the genuine difficulties of maintaining a warrior culture in a changing world. Understanding these struggles is crucial for understanding not just Japanese history, but the broader patterns by which human societies adapt to technological and social change. Military cultures are particularly useful case studies because their effectiveness can be measured relatively objectively, and because the consequences of failure are often dramatic and immediate. The samurai experience suggests that successful adaptation requires maintaining a balance between preserving essential values and abandoning obsolete practices. Cultures that are too rigid become ineffective, while cultures that are too flexible lose their distinctive identity. The challenge is to distinguish between core principles that must be preserved and specific practices that can be modified or abandoned. This challenge is never easy, and there is no guarantee that societies will solve it successfully. The samurai ultimately failed to maintain this balance, but their failure was not inevitable. At several points in their history, they demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt to new circumstances while preserving their essential identity. The breakdown came only when the pace of change accelerated beyond their capacity for adaptation. The lessons of samurai warfare remain relevant for contemporary societies facing their own technological and social challenges. Like the samurai, modern societies must find ways to preserve what they value most, while adapting to circumstances that their traditions never anticipated. Like the samurai, they must balance competing demands and navigate contradictions that have no easy resolution. The story of samurai warfare is ultimately a story about the human capacity for both adaptation and persistence. It shows how people can create meaning and purpose even in the midst of violence and uncertainty. It demonstrates how values and relationships forged in extreme circumstances can influence societies long after those circumstances have passed. Most importantly, it reminds us that the human search for honour, purpose and transcendence continues even when the external forms through which these qualities are expressed become obsolete. In the end, the 1,000 years of samurai warfare were not just about military technique or political power, though both were certainly important. They were about the ongoing human effort to create order, meaning, and beauty in a world that often seems chaotic, meaningless, and brutal. The samurai succeeded in this effort to a remarkable degree, and their success continues to inspire people who have never held a sword or faced an enemy in battle. The echo of their achievement resonates not in the clash of steel, but in the continuing human aspiration to live with dignity, courage, and purpose, regardless of external circumstances. That echo will continue long after the last sword has rusted away and the last castle has crumbled to dust. But there are deeper currents in this 1,000-year story that deserve our attention as we drift toward the end of our journey through samurai warfare. These are the subtle patterns that reveal themselves only when we step back from the dramatic battles and legendary heroes to examine the quieter transformations that shaped how human beings understood violence, authority, and meaning itself. Consider the evolution of samurai attitudes toward death, which underwent several profound transformations over the centuries. The early warriors of the Heian period approached death with a fatalism that was practical rather than philosophical. Death was an occupational hazard, something to be avoided when possible but accepted when necessary. There was little of the elaborate theorizing about death that would characterize later periods. This practical attitude began to change during the Kamakura period, when extended warfare made death a more constant presence in warrior life. The influence of Buddhism became more pronounced, providing frameworks for understanding death that went beyond simple acceptance. Death became not just an end but a transition, not just a loss but a potential liberation from the suffering inherent in worldly existence. But the most significant transformation came during the peaceful centuries of Tokugawa rule, when samurai who had little direct experience of warfare began to develop increasingly elaborate theories about death and dying. The concept of honourable death became so refined and complex that it often bore little resemblance to the brutal realities of actual combat. Death became an aesthetic concept as much as a military one, something to be contemplated, refined, and perfected rather than simply experienced. This aestheticization of death reached its peak in the ritual of seppuku, which evolved from a practical method of avoiding capture into an elaborate ceremony that could take hours to perform correctly. The ritual incorporated elements of theatre, poetry, philosophy, and spiritual preparation that transformed individual death into a form of artistic expression. A properly performed seppuku was considered a masterpiece of human achievement, demonstrating the performer's mastery over the most fundamental human fears. But the irony is that this elaborate refinement of death rituals occurred precisely when samurai were least likely to face actual death in combat. The peaceful conditions of the Tokugawa period meant that most samurai never had the opportunity to test their carefully cultivated attitudes toward death against the reality of mortal danger. Death became a subject for theoretical study rather than practical preparation. This gap between theory and practice had profound consequences when samurai were finally forced to confront real warfare again in the 19th century. Many discovered that their elaborate philosophical preparations were inadequate for dealing with the psychological shock of actual combat. The reality of modern warfare, with its emphasis on mass destruction rather than individual heroism, bore little resemblance to the romanticized deaths that they had been taught to admire. The disconnect became even more pronounced during World War II, when Japanese military culture attempted to apply traditional concepts of honourable death to industrial warfare. The kamikaze attacks that characterized the final phase of the Pacific War represented the logical culmination of centuries of theorizing about death, but they were also demonstrations of how divorced this theorizing had become from military reality. A similar pattern of theoretical refinement followed by practical irrelevance can be observed in the evolution of samurai attitudes toward loyalty. The early warriors of the Heian and Kamakura periods understood loyalty in intensely practical terms. Loyalty was a reciprocal relationship that provided mutual benefits to all parties involved. A warrior owed service to his lord in exchange for protection, land, and support. If the lord failed to fulfill his obligations, the warrior was free to transfer his loyalty elsewhere. This practical understanding of loyalty began to change during the Muromachi period, when political instability made simple reciprocal relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. Loyalty became more idealized, more absolute, and more divorced from immediate practical considerations. The concept of loyalty unto death became more prominent, not because it was more practical, but because it provided psychological stability in an uncertain world. The transformation continued during the Tokugawa period, when the absence of warfare removed most of the practical context in which loyalty had originally developed. Loyalty became increasingly abstract, a philosophical virtue rather than a practical relationship. The elaborate loyalty codes that developed during this period were far more demanding and restrictive than anything that had existed during the age of active warfare. This theoretical refinement of loyalty concepts created significant problems when Japan was forced to modernize rapidly in the 19th century. The absolute loyalty that had been cultivated during the peaceful Tokugawa period was not well suited to the flexible, adaptive thinking that successful modernization required. Leaders who demanded unquestioning obedience often made poor decisions because they were insulated from accurate information about changing circumstances. The tragedy of Japanese military culture during World War II was largely the result of this mismatch between theoretical loyalty and practical needs. Military leaders who had been trained to value absolute obedience over independent thinking were poorly equipped to adapt to rapidly changing tactical and strategic situations. The loyalty that had been cultivated as the highest virtue became an obstacle to the kind of flexible thinking that modern warfare required. These patterns of theoretical refinement followed by practical irrelevance were not unique to concepts of death and loyalty. Similar transformations occurred throughout samurai culture, affecting everything from martial arts techniques to aesthetic preferences. In each case, peaceful conditions allowed for the development of increasingly sophisticated and elaborate theoretical frameworks that had little connection to the practical realities they were supposed to address. The martial arts provide perhaps the clearest example of this pattern. The sword techniques that were developed during the Sengoku period were designed for life-and-death combat in chaotic battlefield conditions. They emphasize simplicity, effectiveness, and adaptability to unexpected circumstances. Elaborate movements were avoided because they could prove fatal when fighting against multiple opponents or in confined spaces. But during the Tokugawa period, when sword techniques were no longer tested in actual combat, they became increasingly complex and stylized. Different schools developed elaborate kata, or formal exercises, that demonstrated technical mastery but had little relationship to practical fighting effectiveness. The emphasis shifted from killing enemies to demonstrating cultural refinement and spiritual development. This transformation was not necessarily negative. The martial arts that developed during the Tokugawa period served important social and cultural functions, providing frameworks for physical fitness, mental discipline, and character development that were valuable in their own right, but they were no longer primarily military activities, despite their continued use of military terminology and imagery. The gap between martial arts as cultural practice and martial arts as military preparation became apparent when Japan was forced to modernize its military in the 19th century. Traditional sword techniques, however refined and sophisticated, were useless against enemies equipped with modern firearms. More problematically, the mental attitudes that traditional martial arts had cultivated were often counterproductive in modern military contexts. Traditional martial arts emphasized individual mastery, personal honor, and spiritual development. Modern warfare required teamwork, tactical flexibility, and subordination of individual concerns to collective goals. The samurai who had spent decades perfecting traditional techniques often found themselves psychologically unprepared for the realities of contemporary military service. Similar transformations occurred in samurai aesthetic preferences, which evolved from practical considerations into elaborate cultural systems that had little connection to their military origins. The earlier samurai art forms were closely connected to military function. Armour was decorated not just for beauty, but to intimidate enemies and inspire allies. Weapons were crafted to exacting standards because their users' lives depended on their effectiveness. Even poetry and calligraphy served practical purposes, providing ways to communicate complex ideas about military strategy and warrior values. But during the Tokugawa period, these aesthetic elements became ends in themselves rather than means to military ends. Armour became increasingly elaborate and decorative, often at the expense of practical effectiveness. Swords were crafted as art objects rather than weapons, with emphasis placed on beauty and symbolic meaning rather than cutting ability. Poetry and calligraphy became refined cultural pursuits that demonstrated education and sensitivity rather than ways of communicating about warfare. This aestheticization of warrior culture created beautiful and sophisticated art forms that enriched Japanese culture in profound ways. But it also completed the separation between warrior identity and military function that had begun with the end of active warfare. By the 19th century, many samurai were more skilled in cultural pursuits than in military activities, despite their continued identification as a warrior class. The irony is that this cultural sophistication, which represented centuries of accumulated refinement and development, became an obstacle to effective military modernization. Samurai who had been trained to value aesthetic perfection over practical effectiveness were often resistant to military innovations that seemed crude or inelegant by traditional standards. The modern weapons and tactics that Japan needed to adopt violated samurai aesthetic sensibilities even when their military superiority was undeniable. This tension between aesthetic sophistication and practical effectiveness reflects a broader pattern in human culture. Societies often develop elaborate cultural systems that begin as responses to practical needs, but eventually become valued for their own sake. This process of cultural elaboration can produce remarkable achievements in art, philosophy, and human understanding. But it can also create rigidities that make adaptation to new circumstances difficult or impossible. The samurai experience suggests that maintaining cultural vitality requires periodic renewal through contact with the practical challenges that originally shaped cultural forms. Military cultures that are not regularly tested in actual combat tend to become increasingly elaborate and divorced from military reality. But the same pattern applies to other cultural domains as well. Religious traditions that are not regularly challenged by genuine spiritual crises tend to become formalistic. Intellectual traditions that are not regularly tested against new evidence tend to become scholastic and self-referential. The challenge for any culture is to maintain a balance between preservation and adaptation, between honouring traditional achievements and responding to new circumstances. This balance cannot be maintained through rules or formulas. It requires constant judgment and periodic renewal through genuine engagement with the challenges that make cultural forms meaningful. The samurai succeeded in maintaining this balance for many centuries, adapting their military techniques, social organisation, and cultural values to changing circumstances while preserving their essential identity as warriors. Their failure came only when the pace of change accelerated beyond their capacity for adaptation, and when their culture had become so refined and elaborate that it could not be modified without being destroyed. But even this failure was not complete. The values and insights that samurai culture had developed over centuries of evolution continued to influence Japanese society long after their military function had ended. More importantly, they continue to offer insights into universal human challenges that transcend their specific historical context. The samurai understanding of honour, for instance, provides a framework for thinking about integrity and character that remains relevant in contemporary contexts. Their approaches to managing fear and uncertainty offer lessons for anyone facing difficult or dangerous circumstances. Their insights into the relationship between individual excellence and collective purpose continue to influence how people think about leadership and responsibility. Perhaps most importantly, the samurai example demonstrates that it is possible to maintain meaning and purpose even in the face of apparently impossible challenges. The warriors who fought at Shiroyama knew that they could not win, but they fought anyway because they believed that some things were more important than victory. Their example continues to inspire people who face their own seemingly hopeless struggles. This is perhaps the most enduring legacy of samurai warfare. Not any specific technique or tradition, but the demonstration that human beings can transcend their circumstances through commitment to principles that extend beyond immediate self-interest. The samurai showed that it is possible to find meaning in suffering, purpose in defeat, and dignity in death. These insights remain relevant for anyone who seeks to live with integrity in a world that often seems to reward compromise and expediency. The 1,000 years of samurai warfare ended not with the triumph of samurai values, but with their transformation into something broader and more universal. The specific forms through which these values were expressed became obsolete, but the values themselves found new expressions in different contexts. The warrior's commitment to excellence became the craftsman's dedication to quality. The samurai's loyalty to his lord became the citizen's service to society. The fighter's acceptance of death became the human being's acceptance of mortality as the foundation for meaningful life. In this transformation, the samurai achieved a kind of victory that no military conquest could have provided. They became not just historical figures, but enduring symbols of human potential. Their story continues to resonate because it speaks to universal aspects of the human condition: the struggle to find meaning in difficult circumstances, the challenge of maintaining integrity under pressure, and the search for purposes that transcend individual existence. The echo of steel on steel has indeed faded, but the deeper echoes continue. They sound in every act of courage, every moment of integrity, every choice to honour principle over convenience. They remind us that the human capacity for nobility was not buried with the last samurai, but lives on in every person who chooses to face life's challenges with dignity and purpose. And so our journey through 1,000 years of samurai warfare comes full circle, returning us to the fundamental questions that have always defined human existence. How shall we live? What shall we value? How shall we face the certainty of death and the uncertainty of life? The samurai provided one set of answers to these eternal questions. Their answers may no longer serve as practical guides for contemporary life, but they continue to serve as reminders that such questions deserve our most serious consideration. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of samurai warfare. Not how to fight, but how to live with awareness that life is brief, precious, and filled with opportunities for both greatness and failure. The way of the warrior was ultimately a way of being fully human in the face of circumstances that could easily overwhelm human capacity for meaning and purpose. That way remains open to anyone willing to walk it, sword or no sword, armour or no armour, battlefield or no battlefield. The warriors are gone, but the way remains.